My name is Jack Peterson. By trade and temperament, I am a historian. My life has been one of quiet archives and dusty books, a methodical search for narrative threads in the tangled mess of the past. I find comfort in facts, in primary sources, in the logical progression of cause and effect. But the past year had been difficult. A cascade of personal losses that left my own timeline feeling fractured and unreliable. I needed an escape, not just to a new place, but from the noise of my own life. I craved silence. A profound, crushing, absolute silence that might allow me to piece myself back together. That's what led me to the Gila National Forest, to a seasonal job as a fire lookout. It promised little more than solitude and a paycheck, an opportunity to be a hermit with a purpose. The tower, perched on a lonely peak 5 miles from the nearest dirt road, was a steel and glass room immaculately designed to attract lightning and offer a 360-degree view of 20,000 square miles of southern New Mexico. The ranger who drove me, the last leg of the journey, was a man of few words. His face weathered into a permanent squint. He helped me haul my personal gear and a box of supplies up the 65 steps to the 15x15-foot cabin. He pointed out the propane fridge, the wood burning stove, and the Osborne fire finder that dominated the center of the room. Before he left, he handed me a single, laminated card, its edges softened with age. "Read this," he said, his tone flat and unreadable. "Everything you need to know is on there." And then he was gone. The rumble of his truck faded, and the silence I had so desperately sought descended like a physical weight. It was vast, ancient, and complete. Alone in my glass cage on top of the world, I looked down at the card in my hand. It was a simple list, typed on an old machine, the letters slightly uneven. These were my instructions, the rules for my new, isolated existence. The instructions read: 1. Log all weather observations at 0800 and 1500 precisely. 2. Scan the viewshed every 20 minutes without fail. Log all scans. 3. Report all confirmed smoke columns to dispatch immediately. Do not speculate on the cause. 4. If you hear your name whispered on the wind, do not answer. It is a trick of the acoustics. 5. At night, keep the cabin lamp on. It dislikes the dark more than you do. 6. You may sometimes see a man watching from the tree line at dusk. Do not acknowledge him. He is not there for you. 7. If the radio transmits a lullaby between 0300 and 0400, turn the device off and do not turn it on again until sunrise. 8. Never, under any circumstances, leave the catwalk after the sun has set. My first reaction was one of academic curiosity, mixed with skepticism. The first 3 rules were standard operating procedure, duties I had been trained on and expected to perform. They were the foundation of the job, the mundane reality that grounded this strange existence. They lent a veneer of credibility to the rest. The others were unsettling. My rational mind, the historian trained to seek primary sources and logical explanations, immediately began to deconstruct them. Rule why for I, a simple, almost poetic, explanation for auditory pareidolia. A common phenomenon in places of profound silence where the wind can play tricks on the ear. A sensible warning against letting the isolation prey on one's mind. But the others were harder to dismiss, Rule 85 personified an unknown. It, attributing to it a primal fear of the dark. The language was specific and strange. It implied a presence, a consciousness that shared this space with me. Rule Phase 6 was even more direct, introducing a human-like figure, but framing its presence as something to be ignored. He is not there for you. The phrasing was chillingly ambiguous. If not for me, then for what? Or for whom? Rule 57 was pure, unadulterated strangeness. A lullaby on a VHF frequency reserved for emergency communications. It defied all logic. A bizarre event that could not be explained away by weather or overwrought nerves. And Rule Fight 8 was a stark command, establishing a clear boundary. The catwalk, the narrow metal walkway that encircled the cabin, was safe territory. The world beyond it, after sunset, was not. It turned my sanctuary into a prison cell each night. I considered the possibility that it was all a prank. A long-running joke passed down through generations of lookouts to haze the newcomer. It seemed the most plausible explanation. A way to cope with the crushing loneliness by inventing a mythology for the place. I, with my intellectual arrogance, felt I was above such things. I would observe, I would document, and I would find the logical truth behind the folklore. I placed the card on the corner of my desk, a curiosity to be analyzed later, and turned my attention to the job at hand. The first few days passed in a haze of routine. I woke with the sun, made coffee, and performed my first scan of the horizon. I logged the weather at 0800 sharp, my voice sounding small and foreign as I radioed it to a disembodied dispatcher miles away. I scanned the viewshed every 20 minutes, my binoculars tracing the endless ridges and valleys. I wrote in my personal journal. I tried to untangle the knots in my own mind. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of the tower in the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. It was exactly the peace I had sought. But as the sun began its slow descent on the third day, a quiet unease began to settle over me. The forest, so vibrant and alive in the daylight, transformed into a place of deep shadows and hidden spaces. The familiar became uncanny, distorted by the fading light. I remembered the rules, and the feeling of being the subject of a prank began to fade, replaced by a cold knot of apprehension in my stomach. I was on the catwalk, performing my final scan before the sun, completely below the western peaks. The sky was a riot of orange and purple. The air was still. I swept my binoculars from north to east, the familiar landscape rolling past my lenses. Then I turned south, towards a distant clearing about 2 miles away, a pale scar in the dark green blanket of the forest. And I saw him. He was standing at the far edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the tree line. A dark, upright shape. A man. My first instinct was a jolt of relief. Another person. A hiker, perhaps, or a hunter making his way home. I kept the binoculars trained on him, waiting for movement. A wave, a step, anything. There was nothing. He was perfectly still. Not the stillness of a patient hunter, but a profound, unnatural immobility, like a statue carved from shadow. Rule Phase 6 echoed in my mind. Do not acknowledge him. He is not there for you. My heart began to pound. A frantic drum against the silence of the evening. My training, my entire intellectual being, screamed at me to observe, to gather data, to understand. I wanted to keep watching, to wait for him to reveal his purpose. But the laminated card on my desk felt like a talisman of a different kind of knowledge, an older and more frightening wisdom. My hands were shaking. I lowered the binoculars, breaking the visual connection. I forced myself to turn away, my back to the clearing and the silent figure within it. I took a deep, shuddering breath and walked back into the cabin, the metal of the catwalk ringing, unnaturally loud under my feet. I slid the door shut and bolted it. I went to the logbook. My hand, when I picked up the pen, was slick with sweat. For the 1840 scan, I wrote a single word: clear. It felt like a lie. It felt like a betrayal of my own senses. But it also felt like an act of survival. I did not look south again that night. I turned on the cabin's main lamp, its yellow glow pushing back the encroaching darkness, a small island of light in an ocean of black. But I could not shake the feeling. A cold, prickling certainty that has not left me since. The feeling of being watched. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every creak of the tower, every sigh of the wind against the glass, was magnified into a potential threat. The single lamp I kept on, as per Rule 25, cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. My mind, the trained historian's mind, that prided itself on logic and evidence, was at war with a more primal part of my brain, a part that understood the simple, terrifying language of being prey. I replayed the sighting of the man over and over. He was too far away to be an immediate threat, yet his stillness was more menacing than any aggressive posture. It was the stillness of something that had no need to hurry, something that had all the time in the world. I tried to rationalize it. A hunter waiting for game, a hiker taking a long rest, a trick of the light, a strangely shaped tree stump that my isolated mind had anthropomorphized. But none of the explanations felt right. They were flimsy shields against a certainty that had taken root in my gut. The rule existed for a reason. Do not acknowledge him. He is not there for you. The words implied a known phenomenon, a recurring event that previous lookouts had encountered and for which a protocol had been established. This wasn't a prank. It was a warning. The next week was a study in forced normalcy. I performed my duties with a brittle, almost fanatical precision. I logged the weather at 0800 and 1500, my voice tight and controlled over the radio. I scanned the viewshed every 20 minutes, my gaze deliberately avoiding the southern clearing. I forced myself to read, to write, to engage in the mundane tasks of survival. Cooking, cleaning, chopping wood. But the silence I had once craved had become an accomplice to my fear. It was no longer peaceful, it was watchful. The isolation, once a balm, was now a cage, amplifying every internal tremor of anxiety. I found myself talking to myself, my own voice a desperate attempt to fill the void, to prove I was still here, still sane. I developed a new, nervous habit. Checking the laminated card. My fingers would trace the typed letters of the rules, as if they were a rosary, each one a bead of terrible prayer. The rules were my only anchor in this sea of unease. the only thing that offered a semblance of control in a situation that felt utterly out of my control. I was no longer a historian observing folklore. I was a believer, clinging to scripture. It was on the 10th night that the second shoe dropped. I had fallen into a shallow, restless sleep. The kind where you are aware of every sound, every shift in the atmosphere. The wind had picked up. A low moan that seemed to carry whispers I couldn't quite decipher. I told myself it was just the acoustics. Just Rule 5-4 playing out. Do not answer. I didn't. I pulled the thin blanket tighter around my shoulders and squeezed my eyes shut. Then, a new sound cut through the wind. A crackle of static from the VHF radio on the desk. My eyes snapped open. The radio was for official use only. Dispatch, other lookouts, fire crews on the ground. It was never, ever active in the dead of night, unless there was a major emergency. I sat up, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs. I glanced at my watch. The glowing hands read 3:17 a.m. The static cleared. And then a sound so clear, so out of place, so utterly impossible, filled the small cabin. It was music, a lullaby. A simple, tinkling melody played on what sounded like an old music box. It was gentle, sweet, and the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. Rule 5-7 screamed in my head, a klaxon of pure panic. If the radio transmits a lullaby between 0300 and 0400, turn the device off and do not turn it on again until sunrise. My body was frozen. Every instinct told me to stay in the relative safety of my cot, to pull the blanket over my head and pretend it wasn't happening. But the rule was a command, not a suggestion. It implied that listening, that allowing the sound to continue, was the greater danger. The music box melody continued its serene, horrifying loop. A sound of childhood innocence, corrupted into something monstrous. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like ice water in my veins, I threw off the blanket. The floor was cold against my bare feet. I moved toward the desk. My eyes locked on the radio, as if it were a venomous snake. The lullaby seemed to grow louder, more insistent, each note a tiny, sharp needle against my sanity. My hand trembled as I reached for the power knob. For a terrifying second, my fingers wouldn't obey. The music was hypnotic, pulling at some forgotten corner of my mind, a memory of a safety that felt like a lie. I forced my fingers to close around the knob. I twisted it hard to the left. Click. The music stopped. The silence that rushed back in was somehow worse. It was heavy, expectant, and felt profoundly wrong. I stood there in the dark, panting, my body drenched in a cold sweat. I did not turn the radio back on. I backed away from the desk slowly, as if retreating from a wild animal, and scrambled back into my cot. I didn't sleep again. I just lay there, wide-eyed and shaking, waiting for the sun. Sunrise was a reprieve, but not a cure. The daylight pushed back the immediate, visceral terror, but it couldn't erase the memory. The historian in me tried to reassert control. It had to be a crossed signal, a freak atmospheric event, a prankster with a powerful transmitter. But the specificity of the rule, the precise time, the nature of the sound, it all pointed to something else, something known, something anticipated. I spent the day in a fog of exhaustion and fear. My hands shook so badly, I could barely write in the logbook. My routine scans of the horizon were no longer about looking for smoke. They were about looking for threats. My binoculars felt less like a tool and more like a liability, a way of bringing the frightening distance into sharp, terrifying focus. As dusk began to fall, a cold dread coiled in my stomach. I knew I had to do the final scan, but I was terrified of what I might see. I forced myself out onto the catwalk, the wind cold against my face. I raised the binoculars, my movement stiff and jerky. I scanned north. Clear. East. Clear. West. Clear. My hands hesitated. I didn't want to look south. I didn't want to see the clearing. But not looking felt like cowardice, like letting the fear win completely. Taking a shaky breath, I turned the binoculars south, and my blood ran cold. He was there. Not in the distant clearing at the edge of the tree line. He was closer. He was standing in a smaller clearing, maybe only a mile away, at the base of the ridge my tower stood upon. He was still just a dark, upright shape, but he was undeniably, terrifyingly closer. And this time, something was different. His posture. Before, he had been facing the tree line. Now he was turned slightly, angled directly towards the tower. Towards me. He was watching me watch him. Rule Phase 6. Do not acknowledge him. My mind was screaming. It was a physical effort to keep my body from reacting, from dropping the binoculars, from shouting, from running. I was paralyzed, caught in his silent, motionless gaze. The laminated card on my desk offered the only path to survival, a single, impossible instruction. I had to pretend he wasn't there. But he was, and he knew I could see him. Lowering the binoculars was an act of pure will, a severing of a connection that felt physical, like tearing my own eyes away from a gruesome spectacle. I stumbled back from the railing of the catwalk, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He was closer, a mile away, and he was looking at me. The pretense that I was merely observing him was gone. We were now participants in a silent, terrifying exchange. I scrambled back inside the cabin, slamming the door and throwing the bolt with a loud, metallic clank that did nothing to make me feel safe. The cabin, once my sanctuary, now felt like a glass cage, exposing me on all sides. My mind, the orderly, fact-based mind of a historian, was shattering. The world I had understood, a world governed by logic and explainable phenomena, was dissolving into a nightmare, landscape of impossible rules and silent, watching men. The next few days were a descent into a new kind of madness, one born of vigilance and profound isolation. I performed my duties on autopilot, a ghost haunting the machinery of my own life. My entries in the logbook became terse, almost illegible scrawls. My radio calls to dispatch were clipped, my voice a stranger's. I stopped reading. The words on the page were meaningless compared to the terrifying text of my reality. My personal journal, once a place for academic musings and self-reflection, became a frantic testament to my unraveling sanity. I wrote about the man, the lullaby, the crushing certainty that I was being hunted. The entries were not for posterity. They were a desperate attempt to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it all. I avoided the southern windows, I would scan the other 3 quadrants with meticulous care. But when it came time to turn south, I would freeze, my body refusing the command. The fear of seeing him again, perhaps even closer, was a physical barrier. But not looking was its own form of torture. The unknown was a vacuum that my imagination rushed to fill with horrors, far worse than what my eyes might confirm. Was he still there? Had he moved? Was he, at this very moment, beginning the slow walk up the ridge? On the 4th day after the last sighting, the wind changed. It had been calm for over a week, the air still and heavy. Now, a strong, steady gale began to blow from the west, making the tower groan and sway like the mast of a ship in a storm. The sound was a constant, low moan, a mournful cry that seeped through the glass and into my bones. I was on the catwalk in the late afternoon, leaning into the wind, my jacket pulled tight. The sky was a canvas of bruised-looking clouds. I was forcing myself through a scan, my eyes watering from the wind, when I heard it. It was faint, woven into the fabric of the wind's howl, but it was unmistakable. A whisper. "Jack." I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was my name. Not shouted, but drawn out, a sibilant thread of sound carried on the gale. I snapped my head around, searching the empty landscape. There was nothing. Just endless trees swaying violently in the wind. Rule Fe 4. If you hear your name whispered on the wind, do not answer. It is a trick of the acoustics. A trick of the acoustics. The rational explanation felt like a flimsy shield, a child's blanket against a monster. The sound had been too clear, too personal. It wasn't just the wind, it was a voice, shaped and directed. I clamped my hands over my ears, a primitive, useless gesture. I could still feel the vibration of it in my chest. I scrambled back inside the cabin, my heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm. The prank theory was now a distant, laughable memory. This was a script, and I was being forced to play my part. That night, the terror reached a new suffocating peak. The wind howled relentlessly, and with every gust, I imagined my name being whispered just outside the glass. I huddled on my cot, my eyes fixed on the single propane lamp in the center of the room. It was my only defense against the encroaching darkness, my only adherence to Rule Fe 5. At night, keep the cabin lamp on. It dislikes the dark more than you do. Who or what was the man? The source of the lullaby? Or something else entirely? Something that had remained hidden, waiting for the light to fail. As if summoned by my thoughts, the lamp sputtered. The steady yellow flame shrank, trembled, and dimmed to a weak, pale orange. The shadows in the room, once held at bay, lunged inward, growing into monstrous, distorted shapes. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the lamp, my entire world shrinking to that fragile point of light. After a few agonizing seconds, it flared back to life, pushing the shadows back to the corners. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my fear. The propane. I hadn't checked the tank in days. I scrambled over to the small propane refrigerator, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the valve on the tank that fed both appliances. It was lighter than it should be, dangerously light. I had been burning the lamp from dusk until dawn, a profligate waste of a finite resource. Now, I was faced with an impossible choice. Follow Rule Fein 5 and risk the fuel, running out completely, plunging me into total darkness. Or conserve the fuel and face whatever it was that disliked the dark. The lamp flickered again, and this time a low hiss accompanied it. It was starving. I spent the rest of the night in a state of suspended terror, watching the lamp, praying it would last until sunrise. Every flicker made my heart leap into my throat. Every groan of the tower in the wind was the sound of something testing the walls. The sun rose, but it brought no relief. Only a temporary stay of execution. The day was a blur of exhaustion and dread. I knew what I had to do. I had to go outside, down the 65 steps, to the storage shed at the base of the tower, where the spare propane tanks were kept. It was a simple task, one I had done before. But now, the thought of leaving the relative safety of the cabin, of descending to the ground, was terrifying. The man had been at the base of the ridge. The whispers had been on the wind. The ground was their territory. The tower was mine. But I had no choice. As dusk approached, painting the sky in apocalyptic shades of red and orange, I knew I couldn't face another night with a dying lamp. Taking a deep breath, I unbolted the door and stepped out onto the catwalk. The wind was still strong. I forced myself not to look south. I kept my eyes fixed on the metal stairs descending before me, one step at a time. The wind tugged at me, trying to push me off balance. My hand was slick with sweat on the cold metal railing. 65 steps had never felt so long. I reached the bottom, my feet touching the solid earth with a jolt. The storage shed was only 20 feet away. I ran to it, my boots crunching on the gravel, the sound deafeningly loud. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers clumsy and numb. I swung the door open, grabbed the first full tank I could reach, and turned to go back. And I saw him. He wasn't in the clearing a mile away. He wasn't at the tree line. He was standing at the edge of the small clearing that surrounded my tower, no more than 50 yards away. A black silhouette against the blood-red sunset. He was just standing there, perfectly still, watching me. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a solid knot of terror. I couldn't move. I was pinned by his presence, a specimen under glass. Rule Fein 6. Do not acknowledge him. I had to pretend he wasn't there. But he was. He was right there. My survival instinct finally broke through the paralysis. I hoisted the heavy tank, and, without looking back, I walked, as calmly as I could, back to the stairs. Every step was an agony of restraint. I wanted to run, to scream, to look over my shoulder. But I didn't. I just kept walking, focusing on the first step. I began to climb. The propane tank was heavy and awkward, banging against the metal stairs with each step. Up, away from him. I was halfway up, my lungs burning, when I heard a new sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a whisper. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from below me, from the steel legs of the tower itself. My blood ran cold. I stopped, clinging to the railing, and forced myself to look down. In the deep twilight shadows at the base of the tower, a second dark shape was moving. It was hunched over, its limbs long and spidery. and it was slowly, patiently, beginning to climb. For a long second, my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The world narrowed to 2 points of impossible horror. The silent, motionless man at the tree line, the watcher, and this new thing, this spidery, hunched creature, the climber, making its slow, rhythmic way up the steel lattice of my tower. The scraping sound was the noise of its limbs, hard and sharp, finding purchase on the metal beams. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. Its patience was a declaration of its power. The paralysis broke. A surge of pure, animal terror flooded my system, overriding every rational thought. I turned and fled up the remaining stairs, my body screaming with effort. The heavy propane tank, which had been a burden, was now a dead weight threatening to pull me backward into the abyss. I heaved it upward, step by agonizing step, the metal canister banging against the railing, a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the steady, methodical scrape. Scrape, scrape from below. I didn't dare look down again. I fixed my eyes on the door to the cabin, the only sanctuary in a world that had turned into a predator's hunting ground. My lungs burned. My muscles screamed. The scraping grew louder, closer. It was gaining on me. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my boots, a low hum that resonated with the frantic hammering of my own heart. I reached the catwalk, threw the propane tank onto the metal, grating with a deafening clang, and lunged for the door. My fumbling hands found the handle. I yanked it open, stumbled inside, and slammed it shut behind me. I threw the heavy deadbolt, the sound of final, definitive note of separation. I was inside. It was outside. I scrambled away from the door, my back hitting the far wall of the cabin, and slid down to the floor, my chest heaving. I was safe. For a moment, the adrenaline and relief were so overwhelming that I felt dizzy. Then, a shadow fell across the windows on the eastern side of the cabin. Slowly, I lifted my head. A shape was rising into view, blotting out the last of the twilight. It was the climber. It had reached the catwalk. It moved with a disjointed, unnatural grace, its long limbs unfolding as it straightened up. It was tall, impossibly thin, a silhouette of stretched and broken anatomy against the dying light. It had no discernible features, just a smooth, dark head that tilted with a bird, like curiosity as it regarded the cabin. It began to circle, its movements silent now that it was on the flat grating of the catwalk. Its shadow passed over each window in succession, a slow, deliberate patrol. It was inspecting its cage. My mind, finally catching up to the terror, began to race. The rules. The laminated card was still on my desk, a holy text in this new, terrifying religion. I crawled over to it, my eyes never leaving the circling shadow. I snatched it up, my fingers tracing, the words as if they could offer a physical shield. Rule A80: never, under any circumstances, leave the catwalk after the sun has set. I had broken it. I had gone down the stairs, down to the ground, to the shed. I had left the designated safe zone after the boundary of sunset had been established. And in that moment, a horrifying clarity descended upon me. This wasn't a list of suggestions or folklore. It was a treaty, a set of terms I had unknowingly agreed to by accepting this post. The first rules were my duties, my side of the bargain. The last 5 were the terms of the other party. The watcher, the silent man at the tree line, wasn't a threat. He was an observer, a sentry ensuring the treaty was upheld. And the climber was the consequence of a breach. It was the enforcer. My gaze fell on Rule .55 at night, keep the cabin lamp on. It dislikes the dark more than you do. The lamp. The new propane tank. With a surge of desperate purpose, I scrambled to my feet. The climber was at the door now. I could hear a faint, inquisitive scratching at the wood. I ignored it, my focus entirely on the lamp. I fumbled with the valve on the old, nearly empty tank, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. I disconnected the hose, the hiss of escaping gas sounding like a dying breath. I dragged the new, heavy tank into place, my muscles straining, and reconnected the hose. I twisted the valve, held my breath, and flicked the igniter on the lamp. A steady, brilliant yellow flame bloomed to life, pushing the oppressive shadows back to the corners of the room, filling the cabin with a warm, defiant glow. Outside, the scratching stopped. I looked up. The silhouette of the climber was framed in the window of the door. It stood perfectly still for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it recoiled from the light, melting back into the deeper shadows at the edge of the catwalk. It worked. The light was a shield. The rule was my salvation. The long night began. I didn't dare sleep. I didn't dare even sit down. I stood in the center of the room, a prisoner in my own illuminated cell, turning slowly, tracking the climber's movements as it continued its patient, endless circling of the catwalk. For hours, the only sounds were the moan of the wind and the soft, rhythmic footfalls of the creature on the metal grating outside. It never tried the door again. It never touched the glass. It just watched, waiting for the light to fail. My historian's mind, what was left of it, tried to analyze, to understand. What was this thing? A creature of the deep woods, a species unknown to science, or something else? Something older, a spirit bound to this peak, this tower, by a pact made by the first men who dared to build here. The questions were meaningless. The only truth was the light, and the shadow that paced just beyond its reach. Sometime after midnight, the wind died down. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by my own ragged breathing. The climber stopped its patrol. It stood motionless outside the south, facing window, the same direction where I had first seen the watcher. It was a dark, patient statue, its form just barely visible against the star-dusted sky. It was waiting. My own exhaustion was a physical weight. My eyes burned from staring. My body ached from standing. But fear was a potent stimulant. I watched the flame of the lamp, my new god. It was my sun, my hope, my entire universe. And then it flickered. My heart stopped. The steady flame dipped, shrinking for a terrifying second, before flaring back to life. I stared at the tank, a cold dread washing over me. It was a new tank, yes, but how long would it last? How much fuel had I used in the preceding nights? The climber stirred. Its head tilted, as if it had heard the flicker, if it could sense the subtle shift in the quality of the light. It took a slow step toward the window. The lamp flickered again, longer this time. The flame shrank to a tiny blue nub, and the cabin was plunged into near darkness. In that instant of profound gloom, the climber lunged. A sharp, cracking sound echoed through the cabin as its hand struck the glass. The window shuddered in its frame but held. The flame sputtered back to life, weak but present, and the creature retreated again with a low hiss that sounded like tearing fabric. It was a race against the dying of the light. I looked around the cabin frantically, my mind searching for a solution. There was none. I was trapped, my fate tied to the slow consumption of a finite resource. The lamp flickered again, and again. Each time the darkness rushed in, the climber struck the glass, a little harder, a little more insistently. The window began to show a network of fine, spidery cracks emanating from the point of impact. It wouldn't hold for much longer. This was it. This was how it ended. My intellectual arrogance, my search for silence, it had all led me here. To be torn apart by a creature of shadow, in a glass box on top of the world. As the flame died down for what felt like the last time, an idea, born of pure, desperate insanity, sparked in my mind. The Osborne Fire Finder. Its base was polished metal. A reflector. In the near total darkness, I lunged for the fire finder, my hands closing around the heavy metal map disc. The climber slammed against the window again, the sound a deafening crack. I ripped the fire finder from its mount, turned and held it up just as the lamp gave one final, brilliant flare. A dying star's last gasp. I angled the polished surface, catching the burst of light and focusing it into a single, brilliant beam, aimed directly at the creature's face. A scream tore through the night. It was not human. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a shriek of grinding metal and tearing flesh. The creature recoiled violently, stumbling back from the window, shielding its face with its long, spindly arms. It thrashed on the catwalk, its limbs flailing, and then, with a final, agonized cry, it scrambled over the railing and disappeared into the darkness below. The lamp died. The cabin was plunged into absolute blackness. I stood there, shaking, holding the useless fire fender, listening to the sound of the creature, crashing its way down the tower and into the forest below. I stood there in the dark for an eternity waiting, but it did not return. And then, slowly, miraculously, the first faint hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky. Dawn was coming. As the sun rose, painting the sky in colors of impossible beauty, I saw the Watcher one last time. He was standing in the distant southern clearing, a silent silhouette. As the first direct rays of sunlight struck the peak, he seemed to dissolve, fading into the morning mist until he was gone. I had survived. I spent the day in a state of shock, mechanically cleaning up the cabin, my movements slow and robotic. I did not log the events of the night. There were no words for them. At 0800, I picked up the radio. My voice was a hollow croak as I read the weather report to a cheerful, oblivious dispatcher. Clear, I said, my gaze sweeping over a world that was forever changed. The silence I had sought was here, but it was no longer a comfort. It was a void, filled with the memory of scraping metal and a scream that did not belong in this world. My solitude was no longer a choice. It was a sentence. I looked at the laminated card on my desk. Its 8 rules no longer a curiosity, but the articles of my new, terrible faith. I was a historian who had stumbled upon a history that was still alive, and I was its prisoner.